It was a trap, meticulously designed, a final, brutal test for the only person who had managed to walk into his life without setting off the alarms in his head. Julian Carter, at 40, was a king in a castle of his own making, and his kingdom was silence. There was a time when his name was a force, a voice that commanded shipping empires and echoed in boardrooms. That voice was now buried beneath layers of pain, betrayal, and the bitter lesson that trust was a currency for fools. He lived in a grand, red brick mansion on the outskirts of Savannah, Georgia, a place with 26 rooms, 16 hidden. Cameras and marble floors so polished they reflected the ghosts of a happier time. The locals whispered stories of the paranoid, eccentric billionaire who had fired his gardener for asking too many questions. They didn't know the truth. He hadn't seen his son try to have him declared mentally unfit to steal the family trust. He hadn't seen the empty bank accounts his daughter left behind, the same girl who used to cling to him during thunderstorms. They hadn't read the forged medical bills from the doctor. He once called his brother Julian had learned the hard way. People don't just lie. They wait, they watch, and they smile to your face while they do it. And then there was Grace, his late wife, the only person who ever made the cold mansion feel like a home. She filled it with the scent of wildflowers and cinnamon, but cancer had stolen her slowly. And with her went the last bit of color in Julian's world. Since then, the house had become a tomb. He never touched her library, a sacred, spotless room. A monument to the only person he ever truly trusted. His days were a strict, lonely routine. Coffee, oatmeal, long hours staring at silent surveillance feeds, inspecting every delivered apple for poison. The man who once oversaw global trade now lived as a prisoner of his own paranoia, till the morning he was forced to admit a new truth. His body was failing, the tremor in his hand, the creeping fatigue. He needed help. He called a staffing agency with a list of impossible demands. No criminal history, no social media, no small talk, no curiosity. They sent him 3 profiles. He discarded 2 instantly. The third caught his eye. Zarya Brooks, 27 years old. Her file said she was driven by purpose, not profit. He snorted. Empty words. But something made him pause. On Tuesday morning, he watched on his security feed as she stepped off a faded city bus and walked to his front gate. No makeup, no jewelry, just a calm presence and eyes that didn't flinch at the imposing ironwork. When he opened the door, she didn't force a smile. She simply bowed her head slightly and waited for his permission to enter. She understood boundaries. Inside, he led her to the sitting room. Before he could speak, she asked a question that froze him. "The library," she said, her voice quiet and direct. "Should I dust the shelves only, or would you prefer the books arranged by height?" He stared at her. No one had ever asked a question so detailed, so respectful of his unspoken rules. "Just dust," Julian replied, his voice raspy from disuse. "Everything in that room stays exactly as it is." She nodded, made a note in a small book, and asked a few more precise, professional questions. Not once did she ask about his family, his past, or his wealth. When she left, he found himself watching her walk down the long path. The first person to enter his home in years who hadn't triggered a storm of panic in his chest. But that didn't mean he trusted her. The next morning, before she arrived, Julian walked to the east wing to a door no one else ever entered. His private safe room. Side were stacks of cash, gold bars, his late wife's jewelry, and on a small table, a single folded piece of paper. The safe's combination. A careless mistake. Perfect test. He propped the heavy steel door slightly ajar, the riches inside glinting in the single overhead light. A temptation in its purest form. Back in the surveillance room, Julian sank into his leather chair, his eyes fixed on the monitor. The trap was set. Now, he would wait and see if Zarya Brooks was any different from the rest of them. Julian's heartbeat echoed louder than the hum of the security feeds. At exactly 8 a.m., Zarya entered the house. She moved with a quiet efficiency that was almost unnerving, a ghost of purpose in the tomb of his mansion. For over an hour, She dusted shelves, arranged pillows, and scrubbed corners, never once giving the scattered valuables a Fabergé egg here, a Ming vase, there more than a professional glance. Then, the moment came. She walked down the east wing corridor. Julian leaned forward, his knuckles white as he gripped the arms of his chair. She paused at the open door of the safe room. She saw it. Julian watched her freeze on the monitor, a flicker of something shock, confusion crossing her face. Her hand holding a dusting cloth trembled slightly, clenched his jaw, a familiar, bitter certainty rising in him. Here it is, he thought, the moment the mask slips. He was certain she would step inside, but Zarya didn't. Instead, after a long, still moment, she slowly pulled out her phone, backed away from the doorway, and made a call. Julian expertly read her lips as she spoke to his off-site secretary. Her voice, he imagined, as calm and steady as her posture. She was reporting the open safe. She asked if she should lock it herself or wait for further instructions. For the first time in a decade, Julian's eyes widened, not in fear, but in pure, unadulterated surprise. Someone had just passed the test. Still, he didn't let his guard down. People pretend, he reminded himself, the old wounds throbbing. They pretend until the reward is big enough. As if on cue, the universe decided to raise the stakes. Moments later, Zarya's phone buzzed again. A personal call. Her expression changed in an instant, the professional mask crumbling to reveal a daughter's raw panic. Julian zoomed the camera in, focusing on her face as her lips formed trembling words. Her mother was on the other end. Her voice, he could tell, shaking with tears. The family grocery store, their only source of income, was being shut down by creditors. They needed $38,000 by the end of the week, or they would lose everything. Zarya listened, silent tears now streaming down her face. She promised her mother she would find a way, that she would fix it. Then she hung up, her entire body trembling with the shock of her family's looming ruin. She stood there for a long moment, her back to the wall, her gaze fixed on the open door of the safe room. The test had just changed.
Oh.
Before, it was a question of abstract integrity. Now it was a question of survival. One step forward, a few bundles of cash from a fortune so vast they would never be missed, and her family's entire future could be saved.
Yes.
The temptation was no longer a whisper. It was a roar. Julian leaned so close to the screen he could see his own reflection in it, his own heart pounding. Asterisk, Zarya stood frozen in the hallway, the open safe door silently daring her. A single step forward, one handful of cash from a billionaire who would never notice it was gone, and her family's entire future could be saved. Her heart thundered in her chest. The thought was a clawing, desperate thing inside her mind, a voice whispering of easy solutions to impossible problems. He would never know. You would be a hero. Just one step, but then another voice, quieter but stronger, rose to meet it. Her mother's voice from a long time ago, teaching her that a person's true wealth wasn't what they had, but what they were willing to live without. Her father's, telling her that integrity was the one thing no one could ever steal from you, unless you gave it away. Zarya closed her eyes and took a long, trembling breath. This wasn't her. Slowly, her eyes opened, now clear and resolute. She reached not for the cash, but for the small slip of paper on the table beside the safe, the combination code. Then, with a steady hand, she walked to the safe. Instead of using the code to open it wider, she punched in a random sequence of numbers. The safe beeped. The heavy steel door swung shut with a solid, definitive thud, and the locking mechanism engaged with a final, echoing click. Zarya folded the code slip, tucked it deep into her pocket, and then, as if the strength that had held her together for hours had finally given out, she collapsed into a nearby chair, and then she cried, not because she regretted her choice, but because it had taken everything in her to make it. In the surveillance room, Julian sat perfectly still, his eyes wide, unmoving. He had seen people lie. He had seen them cheat. He had seen them steal. But he had never, in his entire bitter life, seen someone deliberately lock temptation away with such profound, painful resolve. For 2 more hours, she didn't leave that hallway. She sat there facing the now locked safe, like a silent guard. Protecting something that wasn't hers from a threat that was only within herself, Julian watched every minute. He studied her posture, her calm after the tears, her unwavering dignity. For the first time in over a decade, he felt something stir. In his chest, a feeling he had long since buried. It wasn't just surprise. It wasn't just gratitude. It was trust. When the clock on his monitor struck 6, Julian finally rose from his chair. For the first time in years, his steps felt lighter as he descended the grand staircase, letting his footsteps echo intentionally, so she would hear him coming. Zarya stood as he entered the hallway, her face composed, though the exhaustion of her ordeal was clear in her eyes. Julian looked at her for a long, silent moment. "You're still here," he said softly. Zarya took a breath. "I noticed the safe was open. I called your secretary and stayed to make sure nothing happened." Julian nodded once. "No." Her eyebrows furrowed. "You knew?" "I watched everything," he admitted. "There are cameras. I saw how you handled it." A flicker of disappointment, maybe even betrayal, crossed her face. But when she spoke, her voice remained steady. "I understand. This is your home. You have the right to protect it." Julian stepped closer and reached into his jacket. He pulled out a sealed envelope and handed it to her. Inside was a cashier's check for $50,000.
"This
"Is yours," he said, his voice quiet. "You earned it." Zarya looked at the check, then back at him, a strange sadness in her eyes. And then she gently, firmly pushed the envelope back into his hands. "I can't accept this," she said. "Doing what's right isn't something that should be rewarded with money. I did what anyone should have done." Julian was speechless. For years he had believed every person had a price. But here was a woman in desperate need, turning down a small fortune with a quiet, unshakable grace. Julian was stunned into silence. For years, his life had been a transactional battlefield where everyone had a price. Every motive was suspect, and every kindness was a down payment on a future betrayal. But this woman, Zarya, operated by a code he had forgotten existed. He looked at the check in his hand, then back at her calm, dignified face. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why are you like this?" Zarya hesitated, a flicker of a long-held memory in her eyes. Then she finally shared the truth. "Years ago," she began softly, "my younger cousin needed a heart. Surgery we couldn't possibly afford. We were out of options. And then an anonymous donor paid for the entire procedure. We never knew who it was. But when I applied to work here, the agency required a background check, and your name was on a list of the hospital's major benefactors from that same year. I knew it had to be you." She looked at him, her eyes shining with an emotion hadn't seen in years, pure, unadulterated gratitude. "That's why I came here, Mr. Carter, to serve the man who saved my family, not to take from him." Julian's heart stopped. He remembered the donation, a 7-figure gift to the pediatric cardiology unit, made in his late wife Grace's name. It was one of the last things he'd done before the walls of paranoia had closed in around him, an act of quiet tribute to a woman who had believed in the good of people. He never thought he'd meet someone whose life was touched by it. Now, standing before him, was the very person who had just reminded him of everything he used to believe in. He didn't say anything for a long moment. He simply walked to the grand desk at the end of the hall, unlocked a drawer, and pulled out a thick, leather-bound folder. He walked back and handed it to her. "This is the Winters Trust Foundation," he said, his voice now steady and clear. "My wife started it. For years, I haven't been able to find a single person I trusted enough to run it, until today. I want you to lead it." Zarya stared at him, overwhelmed, the folder trembling in her hands. I'm just a housekeeper," she whispered. "No," Julian said, and for the first time in a decade, a genuine, warm smile touched his lips. "You are the only person who has ever reminded me what it means to be human." She took the folder, and in that moment of quiet, profound exchange, they both realized a powerful truth. He had set a trap to catch a thief, but instead, he had found the one thing he thought was lost to him forever, a reason to trust again. And she had come looking for a job, but instead had found a way to repay a debt she never knew she owed. Family isn't always built by blood. Sometimes it's built by trust. Asterisk.